Welcome back. We are returning to the book Visits from the World of Spirits from 1791. Now, I should quickly say that if you've been following this podcast from the very beginning, you've probably noticed that I took a long break from this book, and the reason for that is because it's really hard to read. I'm looking at a scan of an original copy, and this was written back in a time when they wrote the letters F and S exactly the same, and it is really messing with my brain. The S is a very common letter in the alphabet, and every time I come to a word with an S in it, I have to wonder, is this a common word like case, or is it an archaic word that I don't know, like cafe? It's just making my head hurt trying to figure out these words, and I'm not used to expending so much mental energy when I'm reading. It's been a real challenge. I don't know how they read books in English back then with two identical letters, but I have had time to recuperate. I'm well rested, and I'm recharged, and I made a commitment to get through this book. So I'm ready to take on the challenge once again. Now, when I left off, we were in the middle of Book 2, which was a section called Showing That Unembodied Spirits Are Allowed by a Supernatural Power to Assume to Themselves the Shape, Air, Dress, and Deportment they formerly carried in the world. So I'll just pick up right where I left off. We were about to hear a tale called Apparition to a Wicked Mother-in-Law and Others to Preserve the Right Heir from Being Cut Off. Here we go. A gentleman possessed of a very good estate married a lady of fortune by whom he had one son and one daughter. After a few years, this lady died. He then married a second wife, though of inferior quality and fortune to the former, who took upon her to discourage and discountenance the children he had by his first lady, and made the family very uncomfortable, both to the children and their father also. The first misunderstanding between the parties was owing to his eldest son's desire of going abroad, which the mother-in-law would gladly have acquiesced in for the sake of getting rid of the young gentleman on any account, as she had children of her own, but did not approve of the father's supporting him abroad, as it might be too expensive. The young gentleman not obtaining leave applied to his own mother's brother, who, countenancing him in his design, he set out for his intended journey, contrary to the intention of his father. What part of the world he traveled into, I do not remember. It seems his father constantly had intelligence from him for some time, and had been prevailed on to make him a reasonable allowance for his subsistence, which the young gentleman always drew bills for, and they were honorably paid. But after some time, the mother-in-law prevailing at home, one of his bills of exchange was refused, and being protested, was sent back without acceptance, upon which he drew no more, nor did he write any more letters, or his father hear anything from him for upwards of 4 years, or thereabouts. Upon this long silence, the mother-in-law made her advantage several ways. She first intimated to his father that he must needs be dead, and consequently his estate should be settled upon her eldest son, for she had several children. His father withstood the motion very firmly, but the wife harassed him with her importunities, and she argued upon 2 points against him, I mean the son. First, if he was dead, then there was no room to object, her son being heir at law. Secondly, if he was not dead, his behavior to his father in not writing for so long a time was inexcusable, and he ought to resent it, and settle the estate as if he were dead, that nothing could be more disobedient, and his father ought to depend upon it that he was actually dead, and treat him as if he was so, For he that would use a father so should be taken for one dead, as to his filial relation, and be treated accordingly. His father, however, stood out for a long time, and told her that he could not answer it to his conscience, for that there might happen many things in the world which might render his son unable to write, that he might be taken by the Turks and carried into slavery, or he might be among the Persians or Arabians, which it seems was the case, and so could not get any letters conveyed, and that he could not be satisfied to disinherit him, till he knew whether he had reason for it, or whether his son had offended him or not. These answers, however just, were far from stopping her importunities, which she carried on so far that she was perpetually teasing him, and the gentleman was so wearied out with it that once or twice he came to a kind of consent to do it, but his heart failing him, he as often relented. However, her restless solicitations at last produced this provisional agreement, that if he did not hear from his son within 4 years, he would consent to a resettling the estate. She was not well satisfied with this conditional agreement, but being able to obtain no other, was obliged to accept of it as it was, though, as she often told him, she was far from being satisfied with it as to time. He grew angry at her telling him so, and answered that she ought to be very well satisfied with it, for that it was time little enough as his son's circumstances might happen to be. Well, she teased him, however, so continually that at last she brought him down to 1 year. But before she brought him to that, she told him one day in a heat that she hoped his ghost would one time or other appear to him and tell him that he was dead, and that he ought to do justice to his other children, for he should never come to claim the estate. When he came, so much against his will, to consent to shorten the time to 1 year, he told her that he hoped his son's ghost, though he was not dead, would come to her and tell her he was alive before the time expired. For why, says he, may not injured souls walk well embodied as well as afterwards? It happened one evening after this, that they had a most violent family quarrel upon this subject, when on a sudden a hand appeared at a casement, endeavoring to open it, but as all the iron casements used in former times opened outward, but hasped or fastened themselves in the inside, so the hand seemed to try to open the casement, but could not. The gentleman did not see it, but his wife did, and she presently started up as if she was frighted, and forgetting the quarrel they had upon their hands, "Lord bless me," says she, "there are thieves in the garden." Her husband ran immediately to the door of the room they sat in, and opening it, looked out. "There's nobody in the garden," says he. So he shut the door again and came back. "I am sure," says she, "I saw a man there." "It must be the devil then," says he, "for I am sure there's nobody in the garden." "I'll swear," says she, "I saw a man put his hand up to open the casement, but finding it fast, and I suppose," adds she, "seeing us in the room, he walked off." "It is impossible he could be gone," says he. "Did not I run to the door immediately? And you know the garden walls on both sides hinder him from escaping." "Prithee," says she angrily, "I am not drunk nor in a dream. I know a man when I see him, and it is not dark, the sun is not quite down." "You are only frighted with shadows," says he, very full of ill nature. "Folks generally are so that are haunted with an evil conscience. It may be 'twas the devil." "No, no, I am not soon frightened," says she. "If 'twas the devil, 'twas the ghost of your son, who perhaps may be come to tell you he was gone to the devil, and you might give your estate to your eldest bastard, since you won't settle it on the lawful heir." "If it was my son," says he, "he has come to tell us he is alive, I warrant you, and to ask how you can be so much a devil to desire me to disinherit him." And with these words, "Alexander," says he aloud, repeating it twice, and starting up out of his chair, "if you are alive, show yourself, and don't let me be insulted thus every day with your being dead." At those very words, the casement which the hand had been seen at by the mother opened of itself, and his son Alexander looked in with a full face, and staring directly upon the mother with an angry countenance, cried out, "Here and then vanished in a moment. The woman, who was so spirited before, shrieked out in a most dismal manner, so as to alarm the whole house. Her maid ran into the parlor to see what was the matter, but her mistress had fainted away in her chair. Her husband ran immediately from the parlor into the garden, and from thence to 2 other doors which opened out of his garden, one into the stable yard, and another into the field beyond the garden, but found them all fast shut and barred. Returning into the garden, he found his gardener and a boy drawing a rolling stone. He asked them if anybody else had been in the garden, but they both solemnly affirmed that nobody had been there, and they were both rolling a gravel walk near the house. Upon this he came into the room, sat him down again, and said not one word for a good while, the women and servants being busy all the while, and in a hurry endeavoring to recover his wife. After some time she came to herself so far as to speak, and the first words she said were, "Lord bless me, what was it?" "Nay," says her husband, "'twas Alexander, to be sure." With that she fell into a fit, and screamed and shrieked out again most terribly. Her husband, not thinking that would have affected her, did what he could to persuade her out of it again, but that would not do, and they were obliged to carry her to bed, and get some help to her, but she continued very ill for several days after. However, this put an end for some considerable time to her solicitations about his disinheriting her son-in-law. But time, that hardens the mind in cases of a worse nature, wore this off also by degrees, and she began to revive the old cause again, though not at first so eagerly as before. Nay, he used her a little severely upon it too, and if ever they had any words about it, he would bid her hold her tongue, or that if she talked any more upon the subject, he would call Alexander again to open the casement. This aggravated things much, and though it terrified her a great while, yet at length she was so exasperated that she told him she believed he dealt with the devil, and that he had sold himself to the devil, only to be able to frighten his wife. He jested with her, and told her any man would be beholden to the devil to hush a noisy woman, and that he was very glad he had found a way to do it, whatever it cost him. She was so exasperated at this that she threatened him if he played any more of his hellish arts with her, she would have him indicted for a wizard, and having a familiar spirit, and she could prove it, she said, plain enough, for that he had raised the devil on purpose to frighten his wife. The fray parted that night with ill words, and ill nature enough, but he little thought she intended as she said, and the next day he had forgot it all, and was as good-humored as if nothing had happened. But he found his wife chagrined and disturbed very much, full of resentment, and threatening him with what she resolved to do. However, he little thought she intended him the mischief she had in her head, and offered to talk friendly to her, but she rejected it with scorn, and told him she would be as good as her word, for she would not live with a man that should bring the devil into the room whenever he thought proper, in order to murder his wife. He strove to pacify her by fair words, but she told him she was in earnest with him, and in a word she was in earnest, for she went away to a justice, and made an affidavit that her husband had a familiar spirit, and that she went in danger of her life, so obtained a warrant to apprehend him. In short, she brought home the warrant, showed it her husband, and told him she had not given it into the hands of an officer because he should have the liberty to go voluntarily before the justice of the peace, and if he thought fit to let her know when he would be ready, she would be so too, and would get some of her own friends to go along with her. He was surprised at this, for he little thought she had been in earnest with him, and endeavored to pacify her by all possible means. She did this to frighten him, and so indeed she had, for though the thing had nothing in it of guilt, yet he found it might expose him very much, and being loath to have such a thing brought upon the stage against him, he used all the entreaties with her that he was able, and begged her not to do it. But the more he humbled himself, the more she triumphed over him, and carrying things to an unsufferable height of insolence, she told him at last she would make him do justice, as she called it, that she was sure she could have him punished if he continued obstinate, and she would not be exposed to witchcraft and sorcery, for she did not know to what length he might carry it. To bring the story to a conclusion, she got the better of him to such a degree that he offered to refer the thing to indifferent persons, friends on both sides, and they met several times, but could bring it to no conclusion. His friends said there was nothing in it, and they would not have him comply with anything upon the pretense of it, that he called for his son, and somebody opened the casement and cried, "Here!" that there was not the least evidence of witchcraft in that, and insisted that she could make nothing of it. Her friends carried it high, instructed by her. She offered to swear that he had threatened her before with his son's ghost, that now he had visibly raised a spectre, for that calling upon his son, who was dead to be sure, the ghost immediately appeared, that he could not have called on the devil thus to personate his son if he had not dealt with the devil himself and had a familiar spirit, and that this was of dangerous consequence to her. Upon the whole, the man wanted courage to stand it, and was afraid of being exposed, so that he was grievously perplexed, and knew not what to do. When she found him humbled as much as she could desire, she told him if he would do her justice, as she called it, that is to say, settle his estate upon her son, she would put it up on condition that he would promise to frighten her no more with raising the devil. That part of the proposal exasperated him again, and he upbraided her with the slander of it, and told her he defied her, and she might do her worst. Thus it broke off all treaty, and she began to threaten him again. However, at length she brought him to comply, and he gave a writing under his hand to her, some of her friends being by, promising that he would comply if his son did not arrive or send an account of himself within 4 months. She was satisfied with this, and they were all made friends again, and accordingly he gave her the writing. But when he delivered it to her, in the presence of her 2 arbitrators, he took the liberty to say to her, with a grave and solemn kind of speech, "Look, you have worried me into this agreement by your fiery temper, and I have signed it against justice, conscience, and reason, but depend upon it, I shall never perform it." One of the arbitrators said, "Why, sir, this is doing nothing, for if you resolve not to perform it, what signifies the writing? Why do you promise what you do not intend shall be done? This will but kindle a new flame to begin with when the time fixed expires." "Why," says he, "I am satisfied in my mind that my son is alive." "Come, come," says his wife, speaking to the gentleman that had argued with her husband, "let him sign the agreement, and let me alone to make him perform the conditions." "Well," says the husband, "you shall have the writing, and you shall be let alone, but I am satisfied you will never ask me to perform it, and yet I am no wizard," adds he, "as you have wickedly suggested." She replied that she would prove that he dealt with the devil, for that he raised an evil spirit by only calling his son by name, and so began to tell the story of the hand and the casement. "Come," says the husband to the gentleman that was her friend, "give me the pen. I never dealt with but one devil in my life, and there it sits," turning to his wife. "And now I have made an agreement with her, that none but the devil would desire any man to sign, and I will sign it. I say give me the pen, but she, nor all the devils in hell, will ever be able to get it executed. Remember I say so." She began to open at him, and so a new flame would have been kindled, had not the gentleman moderated between them, and her husband, setting his hand to the writing, put an end to the fray for that time. At the end of 4 months, she challenged the performance. Accordingly, a day was appointed, and her 2 friends that had been the arbitrators were invited to dinner upon this occasion, believing that her husband would have executed the deeds, and accordingly the writings were all brought forth, engrossed and read over, and some old writings which at her marriage were signed by her trustees in order to her quitting some part of the estate to her son were also brought to be cancelled, the husband being brought over by fair means or foul, I know not whether, to be in a humour for peace sake to execute the deeds, and disinherit his son, alleging that if indeed he was dead it was no wrong to him, and if he was alive he was very unkind and undutiful to his father in not letting him hear from him in all that time. Besides, it was urged that if he should at any time afterwards appear to be alive, his father, who had very much increased, it seems, in his wealth, was able to give him another fortune, and to make him a just satisfaction for the loss he should suffer by the paternal estate. Upon these considerations, I say, they had brought over the poor low-spirited husband to be almost willing to comply, or at least willing or unwilling it was to be done, and, as above, they met accordingly. When they had discoursed upon all the particulars, and, as above, the new deeds were read over, she or her husband took up the old writings to cancel them. I think the story says it was the wife, not her husband, that was just going to tear off the seal, when on a sudden they heard a rushing noise in the parlor where they sat, as if somebody had come in at the door of the room which opened from the hall, and went through the room towards the garden door, which was shut. They were all surprised at it, for it was very distinct, but they saw nothing. The woman turned pale, and was in a terrible fright. However, as nothing was seen, she recovered a little, and began to ruffle her husband again. "What," says she, "have you laid your plot to bring up more devils again?" The man sat composed, though he was under no little surprise too. One of the gentlemen said to him, "What is the meaning of all this?" "I protest, sir," says he, "I know no more of it than you do." "What can it be, then?" said the other gentleman. "I cannot conceive," says he, "for I am utterly unacquainted with such things." "Have you heard nothing from your son?" says the gentleman. "Not one word," says the father. "No, not the least word these 5 years." "Have you wrote nothing to him," says the gentleman, "about this transaction?" "Not a word," says he, "for I know not where to direct a letter to him." "Sir," says the gentleman, "I have heard much of apparitions, but I never saw any in my life, nor did I ever believe there was anything of reality in them, and indeed I saw nothing now, but the passing of somebody, or spirit, or something, cross the room just now is plain. I heard it distinctly. I believe there is some unseen thing in the room, as much as if I saw it." "Nay," says the other arbitrator, "I felt the wind of it as it passed by me." "Pray," adds he, turning to the husband, "do you see nothing yourself?" "No, upon my word," says he, "not the least appearance in the world." "I have been told," says the first arbitrator, "and have read, that an apparition may be seen by some people and be invisible to others, though all in the same room together." However, the husband solemnly protested to them all that he saw nothing. "Pray, sir," says the first arbitrator, "have you seen anything at any other time, or heard any voices or noises, or had any dreams about this matter?" "Indeed," says he, "I have several times dreamt my son was alive, and that I had spoken with him, and once that I asked him why he was so undutiful, and slighted me so, as not to let me hear from him in so many years, seeing he knew that I had it in my power to disinherit him." "Well, sir, and what answer did he give?" "I never dreamed so far on as to have him answer. It always waked me." "And what do you think of it yourself?" says the arbitrator. "Do you think he is dead?" "No, indeed," says the father. "I do believe in my conscience he is alive, as much as I believe I am alive myself, and I am going to do as wicked a thing of the kind as ever any man did." "Truly," says the second arbitrator, "it begins to shock me. I don't know what to say to it. I don't care to meddle any more with it. I don't like driving men to act against their consciences." With this, the wife, who, as I said before, having a little recovered her spirits, and especially encouraged because she saw nothing, started up. "What's all this discourse to the purpose?" says she. "Is it not already agreed upon? What do we come here for?" "Nay," says the first arbitrator, I think we meet now not to inquire into why it is done, but to execute things according to agreement. And what are we frighted at? I am not frighted, says the wife. Not I. Come, says she to her husband haughtily. Sign the deed. I'll cancel the old writings, if 40 devils were in the room. And with that, she takes up one of the deeds, and went to tear off the seal. That moment, the same casement flew open again, as though it was fast in the inside, just as it was before, and the shadow of a body was seen, as standing in the garden without, and the head reaching up to the casement, the face looking into the room, and staring directly at the woman with a stern and an angry countenance. Hold, said the spectre, as if speaking to the woman, and immediately clapped the casement to again, and vanished. It is impossible to describe here the consternation this second apparition put the whole company into. The wife, who was so bold just before that she would do it though 40 devils were in the room, screamed out, fell into fits, and let the writing fall out of her hands. The two arbitrators were exceedingly terrified, but not so much as the rest. But one of them took up the award which they had signed, in which they awarded the husband to execute the deed to dispose of the estate from the son. I dare say, said he, be the spirit a good spirit or a bad one, it will not be against cancelling this. So he tore his name out of the award. So did the other by his example, and both of them got up from their seats and said they would have no more to do in it. But that which was most unexpected of all was that the man himself was so frighted that he fainted away, notwithstanding it was, as it might be said, in his favor. This put an end to the whole affair at that time, and, as I understand by the sequel, it did so forever. The story has many particulars more in it, too long to trouble the reader with, but 2 particulars which are to the purpose I must not omit, viz., that in about 4 or 5 months more after the second apparition, the man's son arrived from the East Indies, whither he had gone 4 years before in a Portuguese ship from Lisbon. That upon being particularly inquired of about these things, and especially whether he had not knowledge of them, or any apparition to him, or other extraordinary intimation concerning what was machinating against him here at home, he constantly affirmed that he had not, only that he once dreamt his father had written him a very angry letter, threatening him that if he did not come home he would disinherit him, and cut him off with a single shilling. This, he added, had a great impression upon him, and gave him serious cause of thoughtfulness, and was one of the principal reasons of his desire to return to England by the first opportunity. Both these stories are taken from Morton's History of Apparitions. And that was the end of Chapter 2. It's quite a messed up family. Sounds like a very stressful situation for everyone involved. Let's see. Now we're going to Chapter 3, and these look like much shorter anecdotes than the one we just read, so I'll read for a little while longer. The stories are going to be Apparition of a Ghost to a Miller to Discover a Hidden Murder, of one Mr. Bower of Guildford to a highwayman in prison, of Dr. Ferrer's daughter to her father, of Mr. Watkinson to his daughter, and Remarkable Occurrence to a clergyman in Lancashire discovering a murder. And there's a note on this first story that says it is from Webster on Witchcraft, Octavo 1678. About the year of our Lord 1632, as near as I can remember, near unto Chester in the street, there lived one Walker, a yeoman of good estate and a widower, who had a young woman to his kinswoman that kept his house, who was by the neighbors suspected to be with child, and was towards the dark of the evening one knight sent away with one Mark Sharp, who was a collier, or one that digged coals underground, and one that had been born in a Blackburn hundred in Lancashire, and so she was not heard of a long time, and little or no noise was made about it. In the winter time after, one James Graham, or Grime, for so in that country they call them, being a miller, and living about 2 miles from the place where Walker lived, was one night alone very late in the mill grinding corn, and at about 12 or 1 o'clock at night he came downstairs, having been putting corn in the hopper, the mill doors being shut. There stood a woman upon the midst of the floor, with her hair about her head, hanging down all bloody, with 5 large wounds on her head. He, being much affrighted and amazed, began to bless himself, and at last asked her who she was, and what she wanted, to which she said, I am the spirit of such a woman who lived with Walker, and being got with child by him, he promised to send me to a private place, where I should be well looked to, until I was brought to bed, and well again, and then I should come again and keep his house. And accordingly, said the apparition, I was one night late sent away with one Mark Sharp, who upon a moor, naming a place that the miller knew, slew me with a pick, such as men dig coals withal, and gave me these 5 wounds, and after threw my body into a coal pit hard by, and hid the pick under a bank, and his shoes and stockings being bloody, he endeavored to wash them, but seeing the blood would not wash out, he hid them there. And the apparition further told the miller that he must be the man to reveal it, or else she must still appear and haunt him. The miller returned home very sad and heavy, but spoke not one word of what he had seen, but eschewed as much as he could to stay in the mill within night without company, thinking thereby to escape the seeing again of that frightful apparition. But notwithstanding, one night when it began to be dark, the apparition met him again, and seemed very fierce and cruel, and threatened him that if he did not reveal the murder, she would continually pursue and haunt him. Yet for all this he still concealed it until St. Thomas Eve before Christmas, when, being after sunset walking in his garden, she appeared again, and then so threatened and affrighted him that he faithfully promised to reveal it next morning. In the morning he went to a magistrate, and made the whole matter known, with all the circumstances, and diligent search being made, the body was found in a coal pit, with 5 wounds in the head, and the pick, and shoes, and stockings yet bloody, in every circumstance as the apparition had related unto the miller. Whereupon Walker and Mark Sharp were both apprehended, but would confess nothing. At the assizes following, I think it was Durham, they were arraigned, found guilty, condemned, and executed, but I could never hear that they confessed the fact. There were some who reported that the apparition did appear to the judge, or the foreman of the jury, who was alive at Chester-in-the-Street about 10 years ago, as I have been credibly informed. Here's the next story. The appearing of the ghost of one Mr. Bower of Guildford to an highwayman in prison, as is set down in a letter of Dr. Ezekias Burton to Dr. H. Moore, and inserted in his works. About 10 years ago, one Mr. Bower, an ancient man, living at Guildford in Surrey, was upon the highway not far from that place, found newly murdered, very barbarously, having one great cut across the throat, and another down his breast. 2 men were seized upon suspicion, and put into jail at Guildford, to another who had before been committed for robbing, as I suppose. That night this 3rd man was awakened about 1 of the clock, and greatly terrified with an old man who had a great gash across his throat, almost from ear to ear, and a wound down his breast. He also came in, stooping and holding his hand upon his back. Thus he appeared, but said nothing. The thief calls to his new companions. They grumbled at him, but made no answer. In the morning he retained so lively an impression of what he had seen, that he spoke to them to the same purpose again, and they told him it was nothing but his fantasy. but he was so fully persuaded of the reality of this apparition that he told others of it, and it came to the ears of my friend Mr. Reading, Justice of the Peace in Surrey, and cousin to the gentleman that was murdered. He immediately sent for the prisoner, and asked him in the first place whether he was born or had lived about Guildford, to which he answered no. Secondly, he inquired if he knew any of the inhabitants of that town or of the neighborhood. He replied that he was a stranger to all thereabout. Then he inquired if he had ever heard of one Mr. Bower. He said no. After this he examined him for what cause those other 2 men were imprisoned, to which he answered he knew not, but supposed for some robbery. After these preliminary interrogatories, he desired him to tell him what he had seen in the night, which he immediately did, exactly according to the relation he had heard, and I gave before, and withal described the old gentleman so by his picked beard, and that he was, as he called it, rough on his cheeks, and that the hairs of his face were black and white, and that Mr. Reading saith he himself could not have given a more exact description of Mr. Bower than this was. He told the highwayman that he must give him his oath, though that would signify little from such a rogue, to which the man readily consented, and took his oath before a justice of all this. Mr. Reading, being a very discreet man, concealed this story from the jury at the assizes, as knowing that this would be no evidence according to our law. However, the friends of the murdered gentleman had been very inquisitive, and discovered several suspicious circumstances, one of which was that those 2 men had washed their clothes, and that some stains of blood remained. Another, that one of them had denied he had ever heard that Mr. Bower was dead, when he had in another place confessed it 2 hours before. Upon these and such like evidences, those 2 were condemned and executed, but denied it to the last. But one of them said the other could clear him if he would, which the bystanders understood not. After some time, a tinker was hanged, where the gentleman has forgot, who at his death said that the murder of Mr. Bower at Guildford was his greatest trouble, for he had a hand in it. He confessed he struck him a blow on the back, which fetched him from his horse, and when he was down, those other men that were arraigned and executed for it cut his throat and rifled him. This is the first story which I had from Mr. Reading himself, who is a very honest, prudent person, and not credulous. Here's the appearing of the ghost of the daughter of Dr. Ferrer to him after her death, according to a brief narrative sent from Mr. Edwarn Fowler, to Dr. H. Moore, annotated 1678, May 11th. This week, Mr. Pearson, who is a worthy good minister of this city of London, told me that his wife's grandfather, a man of great piety, and a physician to the present king, his name Ferrer, nearly related, I think brother, to the famous Mr. Ferrer of Little Giddon. I say this gentleman and his daughter, Mrs. Pearson's mother, a very pious soul, made a compact at his entreaty that the first of them that died, if happy, should after death appear to the survivor, if it were possible, the daughter with some difficulty consenting thereto. Some time after, the daughter, who lived at Gillingham Lodge, 2 miles from Salisbury, fell in labor, and by a mistake being given a noxious potion instead of another prepared for her, suddenly died. Her father lived in London, and that very night she died, she opened his curtains and looked upon him. He had before heard nothing of her illness, but upon this apparition confidently told his maid that his daughter was dead, and 2 days after received the news. Her grandmother told Mrs. Pearson this, as did also an uncle of hers, and the above said maid, and this Mrs. Pearson I know, and she is a very prudent and good woman. Of the appearing of Mr. Watkinson's ghost to his daughter Topham, contained in a letter of Mrs. Taylor of the Ford by St. Neots to Dr. Ezekias Burton. Sir, my service to you and your lady, now according to your desire, I shall write what my cousin told me. Her name was Mary Watkinson. Her father did live in Smithfield, but she was married to one Francis Topham, and she did live in York with her husband, being an ill one, who did steal her away against her parents' consent, so that they could not abide him. But she came often to them, and when she was last with him, upon their parting, she expressed that she feared she should never see him more. He answered her, if he should die, if ever God did permit the dead to see the living, he would see her again. Now, after he had been buried for about half a year, on a night when she was in bed but could not sleep, she heard music, and the chamber grew lighter and lighter, and she being broad awake, saw her father stand at her bedside, who said, Mal, did I not tell thee that I would see thee once again? She called him father, and talked of many things, and he bade her be patient and dutiful to her mother. And when she told him that she had a child, since he did die, he said that he would not trouble her long. He bade her speak what she would now to him, for he must go, and that he should never see her more till they met in the kingdom of heaven. So the chamber grew darker and darker, and he was gone with music. And she said that she never did dream of him, nor ever did see any apparition of him after. He was a very honest, godly man, as far as I can tell. A remarkable occurrence that happened in Lancashire, which was related by a clergyman of that place, extracted from Morton, who took it from Dr. H. Moore. In the northern part of England, I think Lancashire, for I had the story from a clergyman of that country, the minister, before he began to read prayers at church, saw a paper lying in his book, which he supposed to be the banns of marriage. He opened it, and saw written in a fair and distinct hand words to the following purport: that John P. and James D. had murdered a traveling man, had robbed him of his effects, and buried him in such an orchard. The minister was extremely startled, and asked his clerk hastily if he had placed any paper in the prayer book. The clerk declared he had not, but the minister prudently concealed the contents of the paper, for the two names therein contained were those of the clerk and the sexton of the church. The minister then went directly to a magistrate, told him what had happened, and took the paper out of his pocket to read it, when to his great surprise nothing appeared thereon, but it was a plain piece of white paper. The justice on that accused the minister of whim and fancy, and said that his head must certainly have been distempered, when he imagined such strange contents upon a blank piece of paper. The good clergyman plainly saw the hand of God in this matter, and by earnest entreaties prevailed on the justice to grant his warrant against the clerk and sexton, who were taken up on suspicion, and separately confined and examined when so many contradictions appeared in their examination. For the sexton, who kept an ale-house, owned the having lodged such a man at his house, and the clerk said he was that evening at the sexton's, but no such man was there, that it was thought proper to search their houses, in which were found several pieces of gold, and goods belonging to men that travel the country. Yet they gave so tolerable an account of these that no positive proof could be made out, till the clergyman, recollecting that the paper mentioned the dead body to be buried in such an orchard, a circumstance which had before slipped his memory, the place was searched, and the body was found. On hearing which the sexton confessed the fact, accusing the clerk as his accomplice, and they were both accordingly executed. And that's a good place to leave off. We're stopping a little short of an hour tonight. I may have to look up that book, Morton's History of Apparitions, that was mentioned earlier, because apparently that's where a lot of these stories are coming from, and that would be an interesting book to explore in itself. And to give you a little preview of what's coming up, Chapter 4 is going to be of the different natures of apparitions, how we should behave to them, when to be afraid of or concerned about them, and when not, with some remarkable stories. Well, that sounds interesting. Some tips and tricks on what to do and how to behave if you encounter a spirit for yourself. So we'll look forward to that. I don't know when I'll get back to this book. I can't guarantee that I will get back to it in the next episode, but you do have my word that I will eventually get through this entire book, because these are some very strange and interesting stories, and they deserve to be heard, because I don't think a lot of people have read this book since 1791. So, with that, I'll leave you for tonight. Tune in next time.